Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 42. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 81 and 82 of the Prima Pars, that is, on the power of sensuality and on the will. And the translation that I now always use is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get your own at a discounted price from AveMariaPress.com by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether sensuality is only appetitive. St. Thomas defines what he means by this word, sensuality. In the article, he says, sensuality is defined as the appetite of things belonging to the body. Then Aquinas goes on to describe a major difference between the sensitive, apprehensive faculties of the soul and the sensitive, appetitive faculties in the soul. So, for example, sight, as a kind of sensitive apprehension, brings what is sensed by it into it, the color it apprehends. But desire, as a kind of sensitive appetite, doesn't bring its desired object into us, but instead pulls the subject, us, outward towards the object of our desire. Noting this difference, Aquinas writes, the operation of the apprehensive power is completed in the very fact that the thing apprehended is in the one that apprehends, while the operation of the appetitive power is completed in the fact that he who desires is borne towards the thing desirable. Therefore, the operation of the apprehensive power is likened to rest, whereas the operation of the appetitive power is rather likened to movement. Article 2, whether the sensitive appetite is divided into the irascible and concupiscible as distinct powers. Aquinas then explains here that an inclination towards the good also entails an inclination away from that which threatens the attainment of that good. In his words, there must needs be in the sensitive part 2 appetitive powers. 1, through which the soul is simply inclined to seek what is suitable according to the senses and to fly from what is hurtful, and this is called the concupiscible, and another whereby an animal resists these attacks that hinder what is suitable and afflict harm, and this is called the irascible. So within the concupiscible appetite, Aquinas will then distinguish various passions within it. That's love, desire, and joy elicited from the sense good, as well as the feelings which arise from an inclination away from what may be hurtful to that good, which is hate, aversion, and sorrow. Along with these passions are the ones Aquinas calls irascible, which arise from an inclination to resist that which is harmful to the good. In this category are the passions of hope, courage, anger, fear, or despair. Now, I have just very briefly rattled off this list of the passions or emotions, but they will have a meticulously detailed treatment of each one of them in a later volume of the Summa. The takeaway from this article is that the sensitive appetite triggers the passions connected to the simple apprehension attainment of the good in question, fighting for that sense good, as well as running away from whatever might be harmful to it. Article 3, whether the irascible and concupiscible appetites obey reason. Does your appetite for the donut, desire, obey reason? What about your appetite for revenge, what we call anger? We know from experience that whether the passion be found under the heading of the concupiscible, such as desire, or under the heading of the irascible, such as the appetite for revenge, these passions can overthrow our reason, or more precisely, persuade our reason to choose differently than we might have done otherwise. The appetites obey reason, but they have to be brought into subjection to do so. So describing the relationship of rule between the sensitive appetite and the mind, Aquinas says, the intellect or reason is said to rule the irascible and concupiscible by a political power, because the sensitive appetite has something of its own, by virtue whereof it can resist the commands of reason. For the sensitive appetite is naturally moved by the imagination and sense, whence it is that we experience that the irascible and concupiscible powers do resist reason, inasmuch as we sense or imagine something pleasant, which reason forbids, or unpleasant, which reason commands. And so from the fact that the irascible and concupiscible resist reason in something, we must conclude that they do not obey. Yet, on the other hand, the sensitive appetite does obey the will by waiting for its final command. As St. Thomas also says, in other animals, movement follows at once the concupiscible and irascible appetites. For instance, the sheep, fearing the wolf, flees at once because it has no superior counteracting appetite. On the contrary, man is not moved at once according to the irascible and concupiscible appetites, but he awaits the command of the will, which is the superior appetite. Which is a fitting segue into question 82 on the will. Article 1, whether the will desires something of necessity. Augustine says, all desire happiness with one will. There are probably three important things to be said for this article. First, on the differing meanings of necessity. Second, the similarity between the mind and the will. And the third, what we mean by the term happiness. Beginning with the first, Aquinas says, we can say a thing is necessary based on the nature of the thing, like it is necessary that the angles of a triangle add up to 2 right angles, or necessary based on the goal, like food is necessary for the body, or necessary as expedient, like a car is necessary to get to work, or we can say a thing is necessitated based on some outside influence, like it is necessary for the prisoner to remain in his cell all day. Now, of these kinds of necessity, the two that best convey what we mean when we say the will necessarily desires happiness would be the triangle and the food example. The will is a power or potential in you inclined to the known good. That's what it is. Like a triangle must necessarily have 3 sides. That's just what a triangle is. Like the body must necessarily take in food to survive. That's just what the body is. And since man's ultimate final good is what we mean by the term happiness, then the will must necessarily desire it, and experience proves that it does. Then to our second point, to help us understand this first point, let us examine the similarity between the mind and the will. As we said in a previous episode, the mind, in reasoning down to certain conclusions, must begin with some certain starting point to even get off the ground, some concrete assumed truth which does not itself need to be proven in order to serve at the bottom of all other proofs of all certain conclusions. These are what we have called first principles, like the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. In a similar way, for our choices to get off the ground, for us to will anything, that thing must either be a means to some end or the end itself. And since means don't exist without an end, the first thing we must will, to be able to will anything, is the ultimate end or goal. And that ultimate goal is what we mean by happiness, which we will necessarily, and all else as a means to it. And if you want to practically prove that, not just philosophically, ask your friend or family member a series of questions like, why did you get up early this morning? To go to work, maybe they say. But why did you go to work? To make money. But why did you want to make money? To live comfortably. And why did you want to live comfortably? Because of some reason, because of some other reason, because they wanted to be happy. If you ask questions long enough, that is where you will inevitably end up. Which brings us to our third point. What do we mean by happiness? We mean the perfection of us, which comes about by the attainment of our ultimate final good, our goal. But what is our ultimate good? Since the will follows the intellect, in one sense, our ultimate final good or goal is whatever we think that it is, that we've decided it is, which is why some people chase pleasure, others power, others money. But in another sense, in an objective sense, this ultimate good or goal, it is God, which is our next article. But to conclude this article, in summary, the will necessarily desires happiness based on the nature of the thing, the intellectual appetite. And it must will the ultimate final good first before we can will any middle goods or means to that good. And this final ultimate good, which the will wills simply and naturally, is happiness. Article 2, whether the will desires of necessity whatever it desires. As we've said previously, the will, as the inclination to the good, wills the ultimate final good necessarily, our own happiness. But everything else it wills as a means to that end. It does not will those things necessarily. At one point, we may think the donut is a means to happiness, but then after some thought, we might think praying the rosary is a better means to happiness. And since none of these means is a sure, certain, infallible means to perfect happiness, at least in our own mind, we are always free to choose or not to choose them until we see God in the beatific vision, God willing. For once we see goodness itself and are in possession of Him, then we will, based on the nature of the will Him necessarily and eternally. Because in the beatific vision, we will know perfectly and unchangingly that our ultimate happiness is found in God. In St. Thomas's words, there are certain individual goods which have not a necessary connection with happiness, because without them a man can be happy, and to such the will does not adhere of necessity. But there are some things which have a necessary connection with happiness, by means of which things man adheres to God, in whom alone true happiness consists. Nevertheless, until through the certitude of the divine vision, the necessity of such connection be shown, the will does not adhere to God of necessity, nor to those things which are of God, but the will of man who sees God in his essence of necessity adheres to God, just as now we desire of necessity to be happy. Article 3, whether the will is a higher power than the intellect. St. Thomas says it depends on how you ask the question. If powers are distinguished by their objects, like sight is distinguished from hearing, in that the object of sight is color and the object of hearing is sound, then in one way, the intellect is a superior power to the will because it grasps the general idea of goodness, which then becomes the object of the will. The will follows the mind. It can only will the good if it is first known. But in another way, since what is known is in the knower, i.e. the likeness of the thing out there known is in us, but since what is loved pulls the lover toward the object of our love out there, the thing existing in itself out in the world, then we could say in some cases to love a thing is superior to knowing it. This is the case when the object of our knowing and willing is God, and in this way we could say that the will is a higher power than the intellect. As St. Thomas writes, when therefore the thing in which there is good is nobler than the soul itself, in which is the idea understood, by comparison with such a thing the will is higher than the intellect. Wherefore the love of God is better than the knowledge of God, but on the contrary, the knowledge of corporeal things is better than the love thereof. Absolutely, however, the intellect is nobler than the will. Article 4, whether the will moves the intellect. They move one another. The intellect moves the will by proposing to it the good to be pursued. For the will, again, is the desire of the good as known. We cannot love or choose a thing until we first know about it. In another way, the will moves the intellect by being the cause of what we in fact choose to think about. If all that we do for the sake of happiness, including what we apply our mind to, then even our thoughts must find themselves subordinate to the end as a means to that end, and the end we are pursuing, that pursuit we undertake via the will. So they move each other just in different ways. In St. Thomas's words, the intellect moves the will because the good understood is the object of the will and moves it as an end. Now the object of the will is good and the end in general, and each power is directed to some suitable good proper to it, as sight is directed to the perception of color and the intellect to the knowledge of truth. Therefore the will as agent moves all the powers of the soul to their respective acts, except the natural powers or the vegetative part, which are not subject to the will. So he's talking about your digestion, the parts of the body that just continue to work, whether or not you are willing them consciously. Article 5, whether we should distinguish irascible and concupiscible parts in the superior appetite. Aristotle says that the will is in reason, while in the irrational part of the soul are concupiscence and anger or desire and animus. And then St. Thomas explains, the sensitive appetite does not consider the common notion of good, because the senses do not apprehend the universal, and therefore the parts of the sensitive appetite are differentiated by the different notions of particular good. For the concupiscible regards as proper to it the notion of good as something pleasant to the senses and suitable to nature, whereas the irascible regards the notion of good as something that wards off and repels what is hurtful, but the will regards good according to the common notion of good, and therefore in the will, which is the intellectual appetite, there is no differentiation of appetitive powers. And that's pretty straightforward. The emotions, passions of the sensitive appetite are distinguished by their object, which is the particular sense to good, while the object of the will is the universal notion of goodness, which it wills as apprehended in things by the mind. Which brings us to a close here on day 42, having covered questions 81 and 82 of the Prima Pars, that is, on the power of sensuality and on the will. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.